Before we start, I need to note that this is definitely not an interview with the real Jake Sullivan. Rather, it's based on remarks and comments he made at the 2024 World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. Jake Sullivan is the National Security Advisor to the US government. And I have never met him or interviewed him. This interview is based on the remarks he made, and it is voiced by an AI. My comments have been inserted in between his actual dialogue at the event, and in no way do they reflect the questions posed to him or the responses given by the interviewer on the day at Davos. This video has been created to give you an idea about the thinking of an incredibly important person within the US administration. And as we know, the US is one of the most significant partners in supporting Ukraine during the full-scale war and in helping it to rebuff Russia's aggression following the full-scale invasion of February 2022. Well, this is an incredibly complex moment, and I'm very grateful too to be able to hear your point of view on foreign policy and national security.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a few words today at this incredibly complex moment. I think everyone who serves in positions of responsibility in foreign policy and national security likes to say that their time in the seat is the most complex and difficult of any time in recent history. But in our case, it's actually true.
I'm not sure if this is actually true, but apparently an ancient Chinese curse wishes upon people that they live in interesting times. And of course, these are complex, difficult, and to an extent, interesting times. Now, that might be said of people in any generation. We went from the First World War, the Second World War, to the Cold War. But now we seem to be in a new phase, don't we?
You know, the first 2 decades of this forum, after its founding in 1971, were shaped by the Cold War. Then, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, for about a quarter century, the world's major powers seemed to be converging around a single concept of international order. We integrated former competitors into our international economic institutions, and we bet that this would speed and cement that convergence.
And that's an interesting point because even at the height of the Cold War, there was trade between the USSR and various countries, countries which ostensibly were in conflict with it. And in fact, many countries were keen to still cooperate and to lower the tensions during the Cold War. Are we in a new era now?
Today, we're in the early years of a new era. Major powers are vastly more interdependent than at any time during the Cold War. But we're also in stiff competition about the type of world we want to build.
So this interdependence is an interesting thing, especially as we see Russia playing a role as a breaker of rules, as a country completely outside of that world order, and yet who seems to be completely dependent on the manufacturing, the raw materials, the machine tools, etc., that are produced by countries which are supposedly its adversaries. So is this age one of disruptive change?
I proceed from the deep conviction that we are never doomed to repeat the past, and the passage from one era to another comes with the obligation and the opportunity to choose more wisely.
And of course, the mistakes, the crimes of the past do not repeat in exactly the same pattern. But many people have raised the idea that there is some similarity between the 1930s and the current era we live in. This impulse of Russia's to hark back to an earlier imperialistic age, to try and counter the post-world order, to override sovereign borders, and frankly, to engage in the kind of brutality and slaughter we see in Ukraine is something that perhaps we thought we had left behind, consigned to the dustbin of history.
In the face of naked aggression, we are not turning inward. Under President Biden's leadership, we're rallying a global response to push back. We're pursuing intensive and proactive diplomacy to manage our most consequential relationships. We're investing in the sources of our own national strength and those of our allies and partners.
It's interesting you mentioned diplomacy because there is some degree of pressure, I think, to try and end the war or freeze the lines of contact in the hope that there will be some kind of diplomatic solution. Now, don't we risk imposing our own mindset, our own solutions on a country, Russia, that seems to have absolutely no care whatsoever for the international order, for international trade, rule of law, the kind of institutions which we in the West apparently value? Isn't Russia in some ways trying to tear down the international economic system that has created huge wealth in Western Europe, the US, North America, and so on? And with the rise of Trumpism, isn't there a risk that the US is turning its back on that international order that it was so crucial in helping to found?
We're not turning away from the international economic system, but adapting it to the challenges of today and tomorrow. I want to talk with you briefly about these efforts and why I remain optimistic about the future and our ability to meet the main challenge of our time: strategic competition in an age of interdependence.
That optimism is, of course, something we hear from a lot of politicians. We hear it sometimes from diplomats and others. But when we look at the news day in, day out, and if we go back to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it is sometimes hard, is it not, to actually remain optimistic, to actually think that our values are going to triumph over those that would seek to tear them down. Aren't we at a point where Ukraine seems more fragile this year than perhaps it was last year in 2023?
Let me take you back 2 years ago to this day, when Putin had amassed 180,000 soldiers on Ukraine's border, surrounding the country on 3 sides. He expected a quick victory, that he could send a column of tanks to Kiev and topple the democratically elected government of Ukraine, that he could weaken NATO and restore Russia's sphere of influence. But he underestimated the people of Ukraine.
Of course, Ukraine has been far more resilient than anyone expected, but aren't we pushing that resilience to breaking point by not giving them the weapons they need to triumph over Russian aggression? Aren't we introducing more risk into this situation, risk that Russia could gain the upper hand despite its extraordinary incompetence on the battlefield, despite its economic weakness, despite its disorganization and seeming inability to learn all the lessons of its failures in the war? By not arming Ukraine adequately, we are allowing Russia a chance to carry on projecting violence and force, perhaps giving it some hope that it might obtain a so-called victory from all of this suffering and aggression.
For 2 years, with support from a coalition of more than 50 partners led by the United States, the people of Ukraine have remained unflinching against an adversary with an economy 10 times larger, a population 3 times bigger, and a military once ranked as the second best in the world.
And let's turn to Putin's motives. There are many who blame NATO for this situation, but that, to an extent, is a Russian-supported narrative. Do you think this actually is more of an imperialist ambition that has caused Putin to invade Ukraine at full scale? And what do you think are his war aims?
2 years later, Putin has not only failed in his imperialist quest to subjugate Ukraine, his invasion has strengthened Ukrainian sovereignty, the very sovereignty he sought to erase, and bolstered the very NATO resolve he sought to weaken. In fact, while he sought to diminish NATO, his action grew our ranks instead.
Now, in the midst of a certain amount of doom and gloom, isn't it important to focus on the victories that Ukraine has actually achieved over the last 2 years and perhaps not be led into total despondency?
Brave Ukrainian soldiers have retaken more than half of the territory that Russia occupied from the start of this conflict. They've repulsed Russia's attempts at an offensive last winter, and they're repulsing one this winter.
What other victories could we point to that might give us hope that Ukraine could eventually triumph in its struggle to push back Russian aggression?
They've severely degraded Russia's Black Sea fleet, dramatically increasing Ukraine's exports through the Black Sea. They've imposed severe costs on the Russian military, destroying major capabilities built up over decades. And amid all of this, Ukraine has made economic reforms, strengthened its own defense industrial base, and accelerated its integration with the West.
That focus on economic reforms, strengthening its industrial base, and of course, tackling corruption, all these things are incredibly important. But without Western support and financial assistance, this can become very problematic to sustain those developments. And on the battlefield, at least the propagandist narrative, and one which is echoed often in the media that we hear very frequently, is one of stalemate.
Of course, the fight is not over. Russia has laid dense minefields across the front lines, making it harder for Ukraine to make major territorial gains. With China's help, Putin is mobilizing Russia's defense industrial base, putting the country's economy on a wartime footing.
Now, given this recognition that China is not neutral in this, that China is playing the part of a malign actor in supporting Putin's illegal invasion, what can we do about it? And of course, Russia has other allies as well amongst the alliance of autocratic states. So, what do you think are some of the big challenges that are facing Ukraine in 2024?
Russia is seeking more weapons from both North Korea and Iran, which violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions that Moscow itself voted to put in place.
But hasn't the UN shown itself to be completely impotent in this matter? And of course, Moscow, as one of the permanent members on the Security Council, has a veto over a lot of the resolutions that might condemn Moscow's actions more forcefully and perhaps do something more concrete to counter its illegal aggression.
As President Zelenskyy has discussed with President Biden, the people of Ukraine are steeled for the struggle ahead, and the United States and our partners will continue to stand with them.
Well, it sounds like the legal and diplomatic route will have limited chances of success. So, what more can Europe do? What more, especially, can the US do to support Ukraine?
We're expanding training for Ukrainian troops. We're working to secure bipartisan support for the necessary resources to supply Ukraine with the weapons it needs. We're ramping up our own defense industrial base while denying Russia access to critical inputs it needs to do the same.
Now, it's been said by some military commentators, and of course, General Zaluzhny wrote a very interesting article about this, about the role of technology in changing the battlefield, in changing the dynamic on the battlefield, and giving Ukraine an advantage. How is the US and other allies helping Ukraine in this sphere?
We're also innovating, working with our partners, and especially with the private sector, to help Ukraine solve the key technological challenges of an evolving battlefield, like electronic warfare, drones, and demining.
Huge rafts of sanctions have been introduced, including more that have been enacted after the so-called murder of Navalny in an Arctic prison. What more do you think can be done? And why is it important that Russia feels economic pain?
Together, we will build on our sanctions to ensure that even as unsustainable war spending masks underlying weakness, the economic costs for Russia continue to mount.
What do you think are the risks here of not pushing back hard enough against Russia's aggression? What does history teach us about the actions of dictators and their criminal acts, sometimes against neighboring states, that go unpunished?
We will keep supporting Ukraine's diplomatic efforts to secure a just and lasting peace that protects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the principles of the UN Charter. Because we've seen time and time again what happens when aggressors are allowed to take a neighbor's territory by force and don't pay a price. They keep going.
It seems that Russia's capacity for aggression was not properly understood, and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine took many analysts by surprise. Is this a failure of deterrence?
Through a combination of steady deterrence and steadfast diplomacy, we seek to stop the spread of conflict and to create the conditions for de-escalation.
It's interesting you mentioned the word de-escalation here and refer to diplomacy. However, many people will say that, including many Ukrainians, of course, that Putin is not a good faith actor. He does not think, he does not act in the way that Western politicians do. So is diplomacy a realistic route to deal with the crisis in Ukraine? And of course, we're seeing crises break out in other parts of the world too.
Now, as we're dealing with unfolding crises in Ukraine, in the Middle East, we're also managing critical relationships around the world, none more critical than the relationship between the United States and China. The United States is competing with China across multiple dimensions, and we make no bones about that. But we are not looking for confrontation or conflict, and we are seeking to manage that competition responsibly, intensifying diplomacy to reduce the risk of miscalculation.
China seems to be a crucial partner with Russia in its war, and potentially China could be one of those players in this crisis that could help to end it. What do you see the US role and what can be done to perhaps drive a wedge between China and Russia?
We saw this just last November when President Biden and President Xi met in Woodside, California. They agreed to restart counter-narcotics cooperation. And since then, Beijing has actually taken affirmative steps to halt the flow of precursor chemicals used to make fentanyl, progress that we hope and need to see continue.
Well, that's one area of cooperation. But overall, I get the sense there is deep pessimism about the ability of these kind of bilateral relations to actually resolve the huge problems we're seeing. This is, after all, the largest war on the territory of Europe since the Second World War.
I remain optimistic. First, the more others seek to undermine the international system through violence and coercion, the more it brings our allies and partners closer together. This is the paradox that leaders like Putin cannot seem to solve.
In that sense, are the actions of Putin anachronistic? Once Putin is out of the way, might this disappear from the international stage? Or are we looking at an era where countries, where leaders seek to resolve their problems through violence and coercion, like that we've seen inflicted on Ukraine? Or will they revert, do you think, to a more peaceful and diplomatic way of resolving problems?
When it comes to world politics, people around this planet are much more interested in whether or not their lives are improving than in anyone's imperial ambition or imperial project. So, as long as we continue to be focused on offering a global value proposition that delivers for people, that is serious about shared economic growth, tackling climate change, managing new technologies, and promoting good governance, our model will remain much more attractive globally than that of aggression or coercion or intimidation or confrontation.
After 7th of October and the war in Gaza, there's been increasing worries about the escalation of the war. Do you think it can be contained? Of course, the Houthi situation is really complicating it. We see that with the sinking of a British cargo vessel in the last week. But there's not a full-scale escalation that will impact the world economy, do you think?
Look, the risk was real from October 7th, then the risk remains real today. And that's why in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, President Biden mobilized at lightning speed to move U.S. military assets to increase deterrence in the region, to send a clear message to actors who might want to exploit the situation. And we continue to be focused on that.
President Zelenskyy has urged all partners to continue supporting Ukraine financially, but also militarily. And he's also asking for more advanced weapons and missiles. Following the recent attacks from Russia hitting more and more civilians, we're seeing a huge amount of suffering. Is that something that you're contemplating, bringing more advanced weapons in there to Ukraine to help it resist Russian aggression?
I had the opportunity to meet with President Zelenskyy and talk about the battlefield and talk about various capabilities. We had a very good discussion. I will leave it at that. It's best left behind closed doors at the moment. But it was a robust and detailed discussion.
But it seems Ukraine is not getting what it needs. Take the example, for instance, of 155mm artillery shells. There seems to be an ammunition famine, and that has already had a tangible impact on Ukraine's ability to hold territory like Avdiivka and repel Russian attacks.
We've got to be able to deliver the necessary resources to Ukraine for the weapons that it needs to be able to achieve the results that it needs. And that requires mobilizing the bipartisan support we have in both the House and Senate, converting that into actual votes for the money. President Biden is absolutely laser focused on that. We are seeking to get that done in the coming weeks. And in fact, I continue to believe and express confidence that we will, after a lot of twists and turns, ultimately get there. I have held that confidence from the beginning. I continue to hold that confidence today.
We had an order after the Cold War that was based on the rule of law, acceptance of the UN Charter. That order seems to not be the world order anymore. Are we on the way to a new order? Or are we between orders? Or are we heading into a period of disorder?
I think of this a little bit more about a transition of years rather than a transition to orders, but the two are kind of cousins of one another. The reason I draw the distinction is because I don't think the international order built after 1945 is getting replaced wholesale with some new order. It will obviously evolve as it has evolved multiple times over the decades since 1945. But I do think, in a more sharp and distinctive way, we are moving into a new era. The post-Cold War era has ended. We're at the start of something new. We have the capacity to shape what that looks like.
Well, if the Western world has the capacity to shape what that looks like, if we have the ability to make sure that democratic and rule of law institutions are at the heart of that, what will be your priorities and what are the core principles that need to govern a new world order?
And at the heart of it will be many of the core principles and core institutions of the existing order adapted for the challenges that we face today. Some of that goes to geopolitics and showing that crime doesn't pay. That is, you will pay a serious price for the kind of aggression we've seen from the likes of Russia. And part of it's about geoeconomics and how we build or update the international economic order in ways that address the needs of working people, address the climate crisis, address the reality of this major non-market economy. And then part of that also is about giving greater voice to countries that did not have that voice back after 1945 but deserve it today. Adding the African Union just this year to the G20 is a good example of that, but there are many others as well.
So not necessarily a new order, but a new era. Is this, however, a more messy and complex era than the one we have just left?
But yes, I believe we've entered a new era. I think that era is marked by a simple thing to say, but a very complex reality, which is strategic competition in an age of interdependence. The major powers are deeply interdependent. They are also competitive, and that creates the world we're operating in. For the United States, what does that mean? At essence, it means invest in ourselves and invest in our allies so we can compete effectively, but also so we can rally solutions to the world's problems that affect all of us, friends as well as competitors.
So this is more of a multipolar world, to use that phrase that seems to be very popular with Russian propagandists and, of course, with Chinese diplomats as well. But this multipolar world order is one without multilateralism and law, international law. That could potentially create a very dangerous situation. That was tried in Europe, I think, before the First World War. That didn't end so well.
I think there's no reason why we cannot generate global problem solving at scale on the big challenges that we face today. We didn't do so with the COVID pandemic, but that could teach us a lot of lessons for how we do so going forward on both longer-term crises that have become increasingly urgent with every passing year, like climate change, and urgent crises like what is happening in the Middle East right now. We ourselves have the capacity to decide whether we step up to do this. We have the tools to do it. The question is, are we prepared to put those to work? That is a question of political will within our countries and then across our countries. And those who are working to summon that political will need to band together to try to produce a common, coherent response to the great challenges we face in 2024.
Well, thank you very much to the AI for putting a voice to the words of Jake Sullivan. And I'd like to remind you again, this is not a real interview. I have not met or spoken to the real Jake Sullivan, but these are his words, which were taken from remarks and a Q&A by the National Security Advisor at the 2024 World Economic Forum at Davos, Switzerland, and a link will be provided to the official speech so that you can read that and see the actual words of the interviewer and the responses that Jake Sullivan gave to his questions.